You are sitting in a small room with no windows. The walls are thick stone. The door is locked from the outside. In front of you is a table. On that table is a human body. It has been dead for 3 days. The smell is overpowering. Your job is to cut it open. You must remove the organs one by one. You must examine the brain, the heart, the lungs, the stomach. You must do this carefully, methodically, for hours at a time. You cannot leave until the work is done. And tomorrow there will be another body, and another, and another. You do this alone. No one speaks to you. No one thanks you. The people outside this room think you are cursed. They think you are unclean. They cross the street when they see you. And every night, when you close your eyes, all you see are the faces of the dead. This was life in Europe and America during the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, a time when medicine was beginning to change, but society had not caught up. Doctors needed to understand how the human body worked. They needed to study anatomy, but religious laws and social customs made dissection extremely difficult. Most places banned the dissection of bodies, except in very specific cases, usually executed criminals. But there were not enough executed criminals to meet the demand. Medical schools were opening in every major city. Students needed cadavers to learn from. Surgeons needed bodies to practice on. So a system developed in the shadows. People were hired to obtain bodies by any means necessary and deliver them to the schools and hospitals. But someone still had to prepare those bodies. Someone had to cut them open, preserve the organs, and handle the remains. That job fell to a small number of men who worked in the basement rooms of medical colleges, alone with the dead, day after day, slowly losing their grip on the world. His name was Edward. He was 24 years old when he took the job. He had been studying to become a surgeon, but his family ran out of money, and he could not afford to continue. His father had been a tradesman, but he died of fever, and Edward's mother and younger siblings had no income. Edward needed work immediately. A professor at the medical college where he had studied offered him a position as a dissection assistant. The pay was better than most laboring jobs, and Edward knew anatomy. He thought he could handle it. He had seen dissections before, during his studies. He had watched professors cut into cadavers and explain the structure of organs. It had not bothered him then, but watching was different from doing. And doing it once was different from doing it every single day, alone, with no one to talk to, and no escape. The work began early in the morning. Edward unlocked the basement room where the bodies were kept. It was cold and damp. The college stored cadavers in wooden boxes filled with sawdust and lime to slow decomposition. But the smell was still overwhelming. Edward learned to breathe through his mouth, but that made it worse because he could taste it. His first task was to move the body from the storage box onto the dissection table. The bodies were stiff and heavy. Dead weight was harder to move than living weight. Edward had to lift and drag them, and sometimes limbs would bend in ways that made his stomach turn. Once the body was on the table, he began the dissection. He used a scalpel to make the initial cuts. The skin resisted at first, then gave way. Beneath the skin was yellow fat, then red muscle, then the cavities that held the organs. He had to be precise. Medical students and professors would use these bodies for study, so Edward's cuts had to be clean and educational. He worked slowly, methodically. He removed the chest plate to expose the heart and lungs. He opened the abdomen to reveal the intestines, liver, and stomach. He sawed through the skull to access the brain. Every step required focus, but the longer he worked, the harder it became to stay focused. The bodies were not just objects. They had been people. Some were old, some were young, some were children. Edward tried not to look at their faces, but he had to when he worked on the head. He tried not to think about who they had been, but their clothes, their jewelry, the calluses on their hands, all of it told a story. And those stories stayed with him. He started to recognize the bodies. He knew which ones had been grave robbed, and which ones had been sold by desperate families. He knew which ones had been stolen from hospitals. The medical college did not ask questions. They just needed bodies. Edward provided them. He stopped sleeping well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bodies on the table. He saw their faces. He heard the sound of the saw cutting through bone. He smelled the decay. It followed him everywhere. He scrubbed his hands until they bled, but the smell never fully left. He changed his clothes, but it clung to him. People on the street could tell what he did. They moved away from him. Shopkeepers refused to serve him. His landlord asked him to leave because other tenants complained. Edward found a room in a building near the medical college where other people connected to the dissection work lived. But even there, he was isolated. The body snatchers who delivered the cadavers did not talk to him. The students who studied the bodies he prepared did not acknowledge him. The professors treated him like a tool. He was useful, but he was not human. He was just the man who cut open the dead. Edward began to change. He stopped talking to people. He stopped going to church because the priest refused to give him communion. He stopped trying to make friends. He ate alone. He worked alone. He existed alone. His mind started to fracture. He began to hear voices in the dissection room when no one was there. He imagined the bodies moving. He became paranoid that the dead were watching him. He knew it was not real, but the line between real and imagined was blurring. He started drinking to silence his thoughts. It helped at first, but then it stopped working. The images in his head became more vivid. He dreamed about dissecting himself. He dreamed about being on the table, looking up at his own hands holding the scalpel. He woke up screaming. His landlord threatened to evict him. Edward did not care. He barely cared about anything anymore. Imagine doing that. Imagine spending every single day surrounded by death, cutting into human bodies, smelling decay, seeing things that no one should have to see. Imagine doing it alone, with no support, no acknowledgement, and no end in sight. How long could you last? How long before the images in your head became more real than the world outside? How long before you stopped being able to tell the difference? The work was not just mentally destructive, it was physically dangerous. Cadavers carried disease. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhus, and infections spread easily. Edward cut himself regularly with the scalpel. Every cut was a risk. If the body was diseased, the infection could enter his bloodstream. There was no antiseptic, no antibiotics, just luck. Edward watched another dissection assistant die from an infected cut. The man had nicked his finger while working on a body that had died of sepsis. Within a week, the infection spread through his hand, up his arm, and into his blood. He died in agony, screaming, his body burning with fever. Edward prepared his body for dissection. That was how it worked. The people who handled the dead eventually became the dead. Exposure to toxic preservation chemicals made things worse. Cadavers were sometimes soaked in alcohol, arsenic, or mercury compounds to slow decay. Edward breathed those fumes every day. His hands absorbed the chemicals through his skin. He developed tremors. His vision blurred. His teeth started to fall out. He knew the chemicals were poisoning him, but he kept working because he had no choice. His family still depended on his income. His mother wrote letters begging him to find other work. But there was no other work that paid enough. Edward was trapped. He was being destroyed, slowly, body and mind, and there was no way out. But here is what most people do not realize, something that makes this even darker. The medical colleges knew the psychological toll. They had records of dissection assistants who had gone insane, who had killed themselves, who had disappeared. But they did nothing to help. There was no counseling, no mental health support, no recognition that this work was different from other jobs. The schools simply hired new assistants when the old ones broke down. It was cheaper to replace a worker than to provide care. And the workers themselves were seen as expendable. They were associated with death, and that made them uncomfortable. Society wanted the benefits of medical progress, but it did not want to acknowledge the human cost. So, the dissection assistants suffered in silence, and no one cared. They were ghosts, working with ghosts, slowly becoming ghosts themselves. Think about that for a moment. Right now, you benefit from centuries of medical knowledge. Every surgery, every diagnosis, every treatment you receive is built on the work of anatomists who studied human bodies. But those bodies were prepared by people like Edward, people who sacrificed their sanity and their lives. Does knowing that change anything? Does it make you think differently about the cost of progress, or does it just make you uncomfortable? Most dissection assistants lasted less than 2 years. The mental strain was too much. Some quit and disappeared into poverty. Others drank themselves to death. A few went violently insane and had to be institutionalized. Edward lasted 3 years. That was longer than most, but by the end he was barely functional. He stopped eating regularly. He lost weight. His hands shook constantly. He talked to himself while he worked, carrying on conversations with people who were not there. The professors noticed, but they did not intervene. They just watched him deteriorate, waiting to see how long he would last before he broke completely. Edward finally collapsed one afternoon while working on a child's body. Something inside him snapped. He stood up from the table, walked out of the dissection room, and never came back. He left everything behind: his tools, his pay, his belongings. He just walked out into the street and kept walking. No one knows exactly what happened to him after that. Some reports say he was found weeks later living in an abandoned building, incoherent and starving. Others say he was seen begging on the streets, talking to himself, completely disconnected from reality. One account claims he walked into a river and drowned. There is no record of his death, no grave, no memorial. He simply vanished, like so many others who did this work. The medical college hired a replacement within days. The dissections continued. The work never stopped, and Edward became just another casualty, forgotten by everyone except the dead he had spent so long with. The anatomical knowledge we have today, the surgical techniques that save lives, the understanding of disease and injury, all of it was built on the backs of men like Edward. They worked in darkness, handling death, breathing poison, and losing their minds so that medicine could advance. Society needed them, but it did not honor them. It did not even acknowledge them. They were invisible. Necessary but shameful, and when they broke down, they were discarded. The dissection rooms eventually became more regulated. Medical schools started hiring trained technicians. Working conditions improved slightly. But that took decades, and the men who suffered before those changes were made were never compensated, never recognized, never remembered. Edward was one of thousands who did this work and paid the price. Their names are not in medical textbooks. Their contributions are not celebrated. They are just gone. The bodies they dissected were given names and honored by medical students who learned from them. But the people who prepared those bodies, who made that learning possible, were treated as if they did not exist. They were the hidden foundation of modern medicine, and their suffering was considered acceptable because it served a greater purpose. But it was not acceptable. It destroyed them. And no one cared, because caring would have meant acknowledging what was really happening in those basement rooms. It would have meant admitting that progress has a cost, and that cost is always paid by the people with the least power. Edward is gone now. The dissection room where he worked is gone. The bodies he prepared have long since been buried or destroyed, but the knowledge remains. The anatomical understanding that came from those dissections is still taught in every medical school in the world. We still benefit from it. We just do not think about the people who made it possible. We do not think about the men who went insane so that doctors could learn to save lives. We do not think about Edward alone in a locked room, cutting into the dead, losing pieces of himself with every incision, until there was nothing left. And if you think this is the most psychologically damaging job in history, you would be wrong. There were others, jobs that broke people even faster, jobs that destroyed not just sanity but identity, jobs that erased people completely. And some of those jobs still exist today.